Welcome. Let's review for test one. Based on the submissions on Schoology, I'll be reviewing some of the concepts that were on the review sheet. Let's start with the gender gap. And the gender gap is just the difference between how men and women vote in different elections and how they stand on issues. So let's, for an example, look at what men are more likely to vote for. They're more likely to be in support of capital punishment. They are more likely to support the lessening of gun restrictions or no gun restrictions, and also less government involvement in our lives, which means they tend to vote Republican more often than women do. Women are more likely to favor safety net programs, gun control, bigger government, thus they tend to vote more democratically. Party identification this is when you identify yourself as a member of one party or another. So we're going to register to vote next week, and if you choose to identify with the Republican or the Democratic Party, you're going to put that down, and thus you have identified a party. Clearly that's something that will change or strengthen as you get older and have more life experiences and as your situatedness in life changes. You can obviously change your party affiliation on your voter registration card at any point in time in life. You can change it 3, 4, 5, 12 times if you want to. And although influenced by the church, the media, and the educational system, it's most successfully transmitted by the family. The family is the most important agent of socialization in your life, either because of the presence of those conversations or the absence of those conversations. Political participation, writing letters, contributing money, volunteering, and attending local party meetings are all examples, but the most widely performed act of political participation is voting in a presidential election. And we as Americans are more often likely to vote in a presidential election versus a local election because we're generally more aware of when there is a general election, which is a presidential election, than a local election. Unfortunately, we don't pay attention to local elections and local politics as much as we do national politics. So why do candidates use polls? Well, first of all, they want to determine, do people know who they are? If you float a name out there, do people recognize it? Because if you don't have name recognition, you can't even get out the door. They want to gauge public opinion regarding policy issues. So when they're trying to fine-tune their planks, which gets to number 4 as well, they want to see how their constituents feel. If you're running for a nationwide office, then that's a much larger poll, and it's going to be more generalized, which is going to cause you to have to move more towards the center. If it's a local election, or say, for an example, a House district election, you have a much more, a much smaller constituency, and so those people are able to you're better able to gauge how they feel about things and thus fine-tune your policy stances so that you have a better chance of winning the election. They also use it to determine if they are ahead in the polls. That's called horse race journalism, what the media does with that. But as a candidate, they're going to decide, okay, so is my name out there? Are people recognizing me? Am I ahead? Am I behind? And then they base their strategy on those poll results. And then the last thing is to identify key issues among voters, because if they're out there talking about issues that the voters don't care about, then they're not going to get elected. How did political parties come to be in the United States? Well, first of all, political parties are not mentioned in the Constitution. It doesn't say we have to have 2. It doesn't have to say we have any. They weren't even mentioned at all because the Founding Fathers felt like political parties were very divisive. But basically it comes down to the fact that we had Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. And the Federalists believed that the government, the way that it was written in the Constitution, would safeguard our protections and not become too intrusive in our lives. And the Anti-Federalists believed that the government was already too big and they did not want the government interfering in our lives and becoming more intrusive, and so they insisted on the Bill of Rights inclusion into the Constitution. And so the Federalists finally agreed that they knew the only way that they were going to get the Constitution ratified was if they appeased the Anti-Federalists with the Bill of Rights. Some influences on the Republican Party. The Christian Coalition has increasingly influenced the Republican Party. The Republican Party has been shifting more towards the right, which would be, where the Christian Coalition likes their politics. Declining support. White Southerners have decreased their support for the Democratic Party. As we've talked about, the Democratic Party has changed. They started to embrace civil rights, and that drove away a lot of white Southerners, known as Dixiecrats. Political efficacy is the belief that one can make a difference in politics by expressing an opinion and acting politically. This is what drives you to become engaged or to check out, and your level of participation. Because if you feel like you're making a difference and that the government has an impact on your life, you're much more likely to be involved. Age, race, religion, and geographic influences. So let's remember that all four of those things are called cleavages because it influences how you vote. Race, African Americans and Hispanic Americans tend to vote more Democratic. It doesn't matter what religion you are, it matters how religious you are. Remember, that's the religiosity. Republicans tend to carry the South, the West, and most of the Midwest except for large cities. And the generational effect is also called the age cohort effect. I forgot the word age in there, so make sure you realize it's called the age cohort effect. And it means that there's usually a defining event for each generation that each generation will use as a filter when voting. So for an example, my grandparents had the Great Depression, they had World War II, my parents had the Civil Rights Movement, you guys have, my generation has the Nixon and Watergate scandals, your generation has the 9/11, and we'll have to see how, if that puts a filter on how you vote and whether it causes you to support more foreign policy initiatives, for example. All right, so there's different types of polls, and the two that you indicated you needed help with were straw polls and push polls. A straw poll is a poll conducted in an unscientific manner used to predict outcomes. And so this is, for an example, if they want to it's the reason that we have it called straw poll, because if you throw up a piece of straw in the wind will carry it. You want to see which way it's going, and that's basically what this is doing. It's just seeing which way people are leaning before an election, but you can't put much faith into a straw poll because A, it's unscientific, B, it doesn't meet the criteria for a poll that should be legitimized, and also it depends on how far out from the election you do them, because as we saw in the 1932 election, they clearly could be wrong. And the second one was a push poll, and this is a special type of poll that both attempts to skew public opinion about a candidate and provides information to campaigns about candidates' strengths and weaknesses. This poll is oftentimes biased. It's pushing information out to the voter to get them to see how they feel about things, but also a lot of times they will misrepresent something. So push polls, although handy to candidates, you need to be leery of them. All right, so you told me that you need to know the difference between the things on the political spectrum, and then also, for example, what a libertarian would support or a conservative would support. So if you look at this chart, if you go left to right, you're talking economic scale. If you go top to bottom, social scale. If you are over here on the left, in the authoritarian left, you like big government and you're okay with them being intrusive in your life. If you're over here, the libertarian right, you like small government and or no involvement in your life. And so a libertarian, for an example, would support anything that lessens the government control over your life. So for an example, the decriminalization of marijuana, which we've talked about in class. And why is that? It's not necessarily that they support the use of marijuana, it's the fact that they don't want the government regulating it. Somebody who is a conservative likes smaller government, so they may not support, for an example, an economic stimulus plan or higher taxes. People on the left are okay with bigger government, more intrusive in your lives, so they may support the Affordable Care Act or government subsidies for things, safety net programs, that type of a thing. Divided government. De-alignment is the process by which you disassociate yourself from both of the two major parties. So you may not really think that the Republican or the Democratic Party really represents your ideology at the point in your life. So you may start to shy away from just saying, oh, well, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. You kind of look at it more candidate-centered, which leads you to ticket splitting. And so that's like if you're looking at the ballot, you may say, all right, I want to vote for this person, this person, this person, and this person. And some of them might be Democrats and some of them might be Republicans. So you're not going in and saying, all right, I want to vote for all Democrats or I want to vote for all Republicans, which is straight ticket voting. You're looking more at the candidate versus the party. Third parties often do not gain traction because of our single-member district and a winner-take-all system. So we talked about the other day in class the fact that, for example, in the House, each district only gets one representative. And so because of that, we're less likely to want to vote for a third-party candidate because that third-party candidate will probably be unlikely to form coalitions and get things done, especially for their constituents back in the district. We love our guy, we just don't love Congress, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens in a couple weeks as to whether or not we're going to vote out the people that are currently in Congress. Presidential candidates fail to win presidential elections if they are a third-party candidate because third-party candidates are more issue-oriented versus being ideologically based. And beyond that, the two major parties will often absorb the reforms that the third parties are, that's a typo, that the third parties are calling for, and thus the third party is no longer relevant. Oftentimes it fades away after their initiatives have either been absorbed by one of the two major parties or their issue was solved by the government in hand. Splinter parties are typically the most successful, and because, first of all, they break off from one of the two established parties. For example, the Tea Party candidates were running on the ballot as a Republican, which means, A, they'll be on all of the ballots in all of the states if they're a national candidate. In some states, it's very, very difficult to get on the ballot if you are a third-party candidate, so that takes that hurdle away. And also, it's just name recognition. People know the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And then if they splinter off of those two, they're oftentimes taking a more, for example, if you're on the right and you're in the Republican Party, the Tea Parties tend to be more conservative. And then you're going to have some splinter parties from the Democratic Party, even though we haven't had one that has been as successful as the Tea Party. And then lastly, voting turnout. 18 to 21-year-olds have lower voter turnout because students are attending college outside of their home state. They oftentimes don't vote for or fill out the paperwork for an absentee ballot and then actually send the absentee ballot in. It'll be interesting to see if that changes when we finally go to electronic voting. That age group often frequently relocates and doesn't register in the district in which they move to. Generally disconnected from political issues, which I hope you're not because you're in an AP Gov class, but typical of your age group. And then service in the armed forces oftentimes leads them to foreign countries and or to constantly be on the move. And so they're either not registered or they're not in the country when they're voting and, again, not filling out the absentee ballots. I hope this has been helpful.